You're listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Now, it is time to break it down.
Welcome to episode number 21 of the Sonny Brown Breakdown. I'm your host, Sonny Brown, and in this episode, I talk to Dr. Alex Channon. Now, Alex is an academic and martial artist who's a senior lecturer in physical education and sports studies at the University of Brighton, and is also on the advisory board of the Martial Arts Studies Research Network. In addition to that, he manages an organization called Love Fighting Hate Violence, which is aimed at promoting the important moral distinction between sport-based combat and violence, and looks at ways that you could use martial arts to teach non-violence to kids and teens. So it's a fascinating conversation relating around those issues of mixed martial arts and violence and what actually is violence in that context. Now let's go to the podcast. Okay, I'm here today with Dr. Alex Channon, who is a academic, and I came across your work first of all with a paper entitled Edgework and Mixed Martial Arts, Risk, Reflexivity and Collaboration in an Ostensibly Violent Sport. And violence is in apostrophes there, and that's what we're going to get into. So how are you today, Alex?
I'm really well, thanks, Sonny. Yeah, it's really nice to be on your podcast, and thanks for inviting me. I love talking about this sort of stuff, so jump at the chance for anyone to listen while I chew their ear off about academic theory and martial arts.
Yeah, no, pleasure is all mine. And what drew me to the article is really you're putting forward a case that MMA isn't really violence as we consider traditionally. And to do that, you encroach on the topic of, or the subject of, edge work. And I love that even more because I find out that its roots of that word is in a Hunter S. Thompson novel, which is brilliant. And I wonder if you can, just give us an overview of what your ideas are, and then maybe into the concept of edge work itself.
Sure. Okay. So the idea that mixed martial arts and other combat sports aren't really violent is something that myself and my colleague Chris Matthews, who I've done a fair bit of work with over the last few years, we've been developing these ideas for a while. And it basically stems from different research projects we've done where he did his work in boxing and I did my work in a range of martial arts initially, but then sort of more focusing on mixed martial arts more recently. And one of the sort of consistent things that we were sort of hearing from people was, this isn't really violence, or I do this and it's a violent sport, but I'm not a violent person. And there was always some sort of qualification that separated these activities from, what people would call real violence, quote unquote real violence. And we found that quite interesting. How is it that people can spend, X number of hours a week learning how to be good at beating people up, and enjoy beating people up, and even perhaps enjoy themselves getting beaten up from time to time, and call it, and say that it's not real violence, or, use some other term to describe it. So that kind of sparked our curiosity as researchers. And of course, doing martial arts ourselves, we'd also had this sort of feeling too, this isn't the same as what happens in a street brawl, or, fisticuffs at the bar, or, domestic violence situations, even though the actions might be the same, punching, kicking, choking people. The meaning that we associate with that action is quite different. The feeling that we get, the relationships we have with the people we do it with, these are all very different. So we decided that we wanted to sort of, have a think about this, as academics do, theorize it, investigate it a bit more. And we published a couple of papers which we kind of challenging other sports academics to think, carefully and critically about their use of the word violence. What is violence to begin with? And is it really fair and fitting to apply it to sports such as MMA, boxing, even rugby and, American football and so on, when the people who do those sports are saying, look, this isn't actually violent, or this is violence of a very different type, and so on. So that's kind of where we started. And, kind of in a nutshell, the core of our argument is that for something to constitute violence, it needs to involve both the sort of the physical force that we typically associate with that term, the punching, the kicking, but it also has to involve a violation of somebody. So if you and I are sparring, we spar within the rules of, let's say we're doing kickboxing. it's perfectly normal and perfectly legitimate. And in fact, I would want you to try to kick me, right? If you didn't try to kick me, actually, then it would be sort of an invalid experience for me. So, there's an explicit sort of consent involved, or maybe it's an implicit consent, but, we meet on the mat, we meet in the ring. I give my agreement to you to try and hit me. I might touch gloves with you, here's my fist, here's your fist, we're going to touch gloves, and then we go. So it's like a little ritual that symbolizes that. Or, the referee gives us a rules talk before a competitive fight and tells us what's allowed and what's not. So there's like formal parameters there that shape what we explicitly consent to in a martial arts context. And we've argued that issue of consent is what differentiates the types of interactions that go on in a martial arts fight or sparring and so on from violence on the streets or violence in other contexts. It's that consent principle. That's plays a large part in the legal status of combat sports, and philosophically, and also from a sort of sociological and social psychological perspective, consent is a really sort of key underpinning principle that makes this different. So that's kind of the main thrust of our argument in a nutshell.
Okay. And so the main thing there seemed to be that even though the actions of punching and kicking are the same in a violent compared to what you're putting forward as a non-violent context, it's the meaning that those actions have behind them. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's what those meanings tell us about the relationship between the people involved. So, in a sparring context, you and I are rolling, let's say, and I'm a junior belt and you're a senior belt. I'm going to get something out of this by you beating me. I'm going to get something out of it by you choking me, right, or armbarring me. I'm going to learn, and I want that to happen. And our relationship is shaped around that sort of, my sort of dependence on you as my senior or my instructor, perhaps. If you and I get into an altercation outside and you choke me, the relationship that exists between us then is very, very different, right? I'm then a sort of an object of your hostility, and I'm being destroyed by you rather than being taught. Does that make sense? It's that relationship that's really important here. And if you think about any context in which we're doing things that we would normally consider to be violence, think about the relationship that exists between the people who are involved. The objective action is important. And certainly when the objective action includes things that might render you unconscious or cause you lasting damage, we need to think quite carefully about that. Am I really clear on the risks I'm taking when I go to box, for instance? Can I really consent to something I don't understand, et cetera, et cetera? But the sort of the core issue here is the relationship that exists between those two people. And is one forcefully violating the other, or are they doing something which they find mutually beneficial?
Yeah, okay, that does make sense. And it's something that is interesting to think about, especially in the context of a sparring practice like kickboxing, where there could be agreed upon intensity where one person will then actually take it a bit further, and there's that kind of negotiation might even happen on the fly, right?
Absolutely. And it's funny, we're trying to write a paper about this now. How is consent actually worked out, in practice? And one of the worrying things is that it often isn't explicitly articulated. I'm okay with you going a little bit harder. We do sometimes do that, but not always. And in situations where, let's say you've got a new person coming along to the gym, they haven't sparred before, maybe the coach hasn't really got their eye on things, and it escalates and they throw a heavy shot when they shouldn't. And that's when we start to see problems, right, in the gym. And it's because of consent. I didn't consent to you loading up on that right hook. That wasn't right. That wasn't fair. And I wasn't expecting it. And so now we're at odds, and now it's not a productive, mutually beneficial exchange. So yeah, thinking about consent, it's not to say that all martial arts fighting is never violent. It's to say that when we don't have consent and when our actions aren't explicitly framed by what we've consented to, then it risks falling into that. And that's why, we need to be, one of the things that we're trying to argue is that we need to be, quite careful with how we approach that as coaches, as practitioners. Are we sure that our training partners are happy with doing A, B, and C?
Yeah, that's funny. I know that when we have someone new, or just ever in general, when we're sparring, the golden rule is only ever hit someone as hard as you're willing to be hit back. And, that kind of gives a good little rough guideline. But, of course, sometimes that isn't good enough because people sometimes don't quite exactly understand how hard they are punching. And so on the topic then of consent, I know that there was a Nicholas Dixon, who you refer to a fair bit in your paper, who was putting forward the idea that really consent can't be given, I think was his main thrust for people competing in a fight, because maybe you could be best explain that. And it seemed to be, though, a common kind of what would be a more mainstream opinion of violence in MMA, right?
Yeah, so Dick's argument rests on the idea that the things that happen in MMA are so far beyond the limits of what's acceptable that it becomes almost like a crime against yourself to allow yourself to be put into this situation. The notion that you can't give consent to allow somebody to damage you is basically what underwrites his argument. The main problem that I had with that is he doesn't really attend to what people who do MMA actually think about MMA. And the vast majority of the points that he makes, while there is a logic to it philosophically, and this is a difference, I think, between the philosophy academics and the sociology academics, such as myself. We're more interested in what people are actually doing and saying, whereas philosophers tend to, not all of them, but they tend to place less emphasis on the empirical data. They're sort of more in the realms of logical, theoretical arguments. So I think what's missing from Dixon really is a sound appreciation of what it actually feels like to be a fighter. What is it that motivates people to step into the cage and to take their lumps, and to put themselves in harm's way? What do they actually think of their opponents when they're beating them? He consistently uses this term that they see one another as worthless objects to be destroyed. And that, I think, I have a huge issue with that. I've never...
Me too.
You get your trash talking, you get your Conor McGregor's giving it all this on the camera, but we know there's a reason for that. That's to get ticket sales, right? Mm-hmm. I think, by and large, the vast majority of fights that I've seen, the small number of competitive fights that I've had in my previous life as a sort of semi-contact kickboxing, I've never seen that people genuinely believe their opponent was a worthless object to be damaged. Yes, it looks like that as an outsider, but when you step inside this world, when you listen to what people in the world are actually saying about it, then that perspective, I think, starts to fall away. So I'm sure that Dixon, if he was in on this conversation, would have a pretty robust argument to what I'm saying, but that's the main issue that I have with it. It's devoid of that voice of people who actually train and experience this firsthand, and the meanings that they bring to the sport.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you there, because I too would consider myself not a violent person, but yet, spend a good portion of every week teaching how to, throw elbows or punches or kicks or choke and all that good stuff. But I'm well aware that that is the perception that people would have of the sport. And, very often when I tell people what I do, their first instinct is to reply along something of lines of, "Oh, you don't look like a fighter." And, I take it that's because, the idea they've got in their head is like, something from the movies, basically, the stereotype. And to me, it seemed like a big portion of what your argument was to kind of bridge that gap then is that fighters are getting something out of the experience. Mm-hmm. And that was where that notion, I think, of Edgework comes into play, where it's the kind of idea of extreme sports and pushing boundaries for a valuable experience and a valuable goal. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, so that's in terms of my own thinking. This conversation has followed the lines of it quite nicely. Actually, the initial idea of the interactional study of fights and what frames those relationships, consent, etc. That was where we started. Then encountering work like Dixon's, this very strong moral critique, which we sort of felt, oh no, there's things wrong with that. And then I came across Edgework, or at least I revisited it. I read it when I was an undergraduate and I've pretty much forgotten about it for a few years, and came across the work again. And it seemed like this was kind of like the missing link in some of this theory that, if fighters aren't engaging in fighting purely for money or because they hate each other, what do they get out of it? And specifically with respect to sports like MMA, which are, I don't like using the word extreme, but I think, we can agree that it's towards the more the sort of extreme end of combat sports, in the sense of it's risky, it's injurious, the kinds of things that can happen, it's There's more variation in the ways you could get hurt and so on. So, what is it that motivates people if it isn't those things that we've already dismissed? And I think Edgework is a really nice concept. It won't work for everyone. It won't fit every fighter that steps in the cage or in the ring. But I do think it has a lot of explanatory potential, particularly. And then this is when I wrote this paper. I went to every study that I could find that was ethnographic. So people who have participated in MMA themselves as researchers, as well as interviews with fighters. What is the voice from inside the sport saying about this kind of phenomenon? And actually, from the theoretical work on Edgework, it lines up very, very well with the empirical work on MMA. So things like seeking out the most extreme challenge that you can find, wanting to push yourself beyond, what most people think is physically possible. Having done other sports like kickboxing or judo, and wanting to go beyond and have something that's even more of a challenge and pushes you even outside of the normal reality of your day-to-day life. So all of these kind of experiences, they kind of tell us a few things about the motivation, which is to seek out those experiences which give us the chance to test ourselves like nothing else can. And that's what Edgework is all about. It's about finding an extremely dangerous risk that gives you the opportunity to test your mettle in the face of overwhelming odds. Can I really defend myself against someone who's really trying to beat me? Well, you can't really answer that question in a semi-contact karate match, but you can answer that question, at least to an extent, in the confines of a professional mixed martial arts fight. So, that gives us some explanation as to, why mixed martial artists do mixed martial arts. But it also points towards something very interesting about their relationship with each other. And if you remember from before, when I was saying, the relationship that exists between the fighters is very important here in the whole fighting violence thing. I can't do my mixed martial arts edge work without you genuinely trying to beat me. So this experience that I'm hungry for, this sort of self-affirming, very, very positive, existential search for my true self, or whatever, however I want to frame it. I need you to genuinely try to hit me and beat me unconscious in order to get that experience. And if you don't try, then I don't get it. So our relationship then becomes, in that moment where we look like we're, very, very strong antagonists trying to knock each other's heads off, actually we're doing each other a service, which is to build towards that opportunity to experience edge work.
Yeah, which I guess is, when fighters will congratulate each other at the end of a fight, it kind of, to an outsider, it might seem just strange why that would even be possible. But, in my own sake, most of the opponents that I've had, keep in touch every now and again. And, there's no ill will or anything like that. They did us a favor by actually stepping up and fighting when, people can drop out of fights and it doesn't happen, and you end up all disappointed, a training camp going to waste. So I guess that's getting that kind of mutual benefit from each other rather than a kind of an enemy or what was it, a useless object or
yeah, a worthless object. I just love the language you use, man. It's but by love I don't mean love. Yeah. But yeah, that's that notion that opponents are there to help each other. It's in sparring, it's much more obvious. I'm there to learn, and my partner's there to help me learn, to teach me and whatnot. If I'm doing a self-defense class, yes, I want to be able to defend myself. So you need to scare me and you need to intimidate me. You need to actually try and hit me. Otherwise, I won't get the benefit of becoming better at defending myself. In a competitive match, I mean, of course, again, to go back to the qualifier from before, not everyone is going to have the same motivation, and not every fight is going to fall into this category. But I think, from what I've seen from the research that I've done, going to events, speaking to fighters, and looking at other people's studies as well, it does seem to be a very normal motivation and a very normal state of affairs that you and I, as fighters, are doing each other a favour by stepping into the cage. Certainly at the lower levels of participation, where we're not looking for big paydays. If you beat me, I don't lose sponsors and I don't, lose out on a purse or whatever. Even at the higher levels, you do have that sort of commercial motivation, but still that needs an opponent, a willing opponent, especially, as you say, to step in at the last minute and save a fight. That's, if you're talking about professional fighters, you're talking about, a big payday. You're talking about breaking even for most of them, aren't you, with the expenses of training. So, in that context, would be the whole Edgework relationship. But there is still a sort of mutual dependency, which is, we need to take into account if we're thinking about, these sort of moral issues.
And so continuing on with that, I guess one of the things I really liked in your paper was the idea of reframing the violence as then a mutually constructed risk between the two competitors. Can you explain that idea a little bit better for us?
Yeah, sure. So if we're just calling the action of a mixed martial arts fight violence, the reasons that I would say we need to think past that is usually the term violence, not always, but most often the term violence gets associated with quite strong moral condemnation. And this is one of the reasons I think that most people who I've spoken to who say, oh, I'm not really a violent person, that's one of the reasons they're at pains to make that clear, right? Because to be a violent person is, to be dangerous. It's to be potentially a criminal. It's to be, bad, for want of a better term. So, we do need to think, if we're going to attach these labels to sports, even if as an academic, I might not always want to conflate violence with something that's bad. People generally do see violence as bad, and there is a desire to clarify and to refine that sort of thing. So, as with the sort of theoretical ideas we mentioned earlier, this notion of Edgework leads us to thinking about the action of fights in a different way. And so it serves us well to think, well, if it's not violence, then we might as well come up with some other way of describing it. Mutually constructed risk is a bit of a mouthful. Might have needed to have worked a bit harder on that, maybe. But I think it does explain what the meaning that gets attached to that action is for the people who are doing it. It's not that I'm engaging in this fight because I enjoy destroying somebody else, or because I want them to try and damage me for its own sake. I enjoy this, and I go into this, and the meaning that I take from it is that it's a risk that allows me to test myself. And again, that sort of notion that I need you to construct that risk comes in. So yeah, a mutually constructed risk, I think, is a better and certainly more adequate way of explaining the action of MMA than just using this quite problematic term, violence.
Yeah, because of course there's so much meaning of the negative connotation attached to violence. And hey, I like the term mutually constructed risk, and a couple of other people I was talking to about it enjoyed it too. So even if it is a mouthful, it's certainly, I think it's got a good ring to it. And
great, yeah.
And so I guess, there's that idea then that people will, get into MMA as a way of developing character and showing character. And, we do that through the process of developing our skills in the sport. And is that a part of the Edgework process itself, or is it, or is that really just confined to the competition night?
So the guy who initially sort of articulated this concept, it is derived from Hunter S. Thompson's work, but it's a chap called Stephen Ling, who's a sociologist who's been writing about sports and other sort of extreme activities for quite a while. And in his conceptualization of Edgework, there are numerous components to it. And the most important one is this thing we've already discussed, this, seeking out extreme risks that allow us to test ourselves and to, see what we're really made of and so on. But what that involves is giving yourself the opportunity to demonstrate mastery in the face of chaos. So in order to demonstrate that mastery, that sort of self-control over your emotions, that remaining calm and being tested and so on, you need to have the skills to allow yourself to exist in that environment, the physical skills. So edge workers of all stripes will spend a lot of time preparing. They spend a lot of time studying, learning those physical skills, developing strategies. They'll get the right equipment in place. They'll do their research. They want to make sure that they don't encounter risks that they can't control, because the point of edge work is to put yourself in a situation that you do have the capacity to resolve, but you're going to be placed in a under so much stress that you test yourself in doing that resolving that situation. So for MMA fighters, you wouldn't go into the cage without practicing jiu-jitsu, because you know that you need to do that in order to succeed. Of course, some people do, and they don't generally tend to do very well. Whether that's stand up or striking, grappling that they're lacking. You do need to have, to be well versed in the vocabulary of the activity that you're pursuing for edge work in order to actually, use it to test yourself to that extreme level. So the skills training element is a central part of edge work in all variety of things. In so much as it's this notion of preparing for a risk so that you know that you can physically overcome that risk, and it becomes more of a mental challenge, that sort of test of self rather than a test of your skill. As for the community and the sort of identity belonging, sort of proving yourself, again, this is something that's written about in લિnk's other work and other people who've used the edge work concept. It's not necessarily the point of edge work. It's not that people do edge work in order to get other people's approval. And there is some sort of theoretical difference between edge work and other conceptual frameworks. One of લિnk's papers, he compares edge work with another famous sociologist, Erving Goffman, who's written a lot about identity and performance, that we put on a particular performance in certain social spheres to sort of get recognition and respect from other people. And certainly there could be an element of this, that sort of presentation of self and that performance of a desired identity in a martial arts context, to try and win status and to win respect. But in terms of edge work as a sort of own concept, it's not the central part of it. It's more that kind of respect, it kind of develops alongside edge work. When you recognize other edge workers, this is someone who's also tested themselves to the extreme and shown that they've got what it takes. You have a respect for them because you also know what it takes. But it's not that you are doing it specifically to win that respect, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I guess there's two portions of that. The first part, I guess, you were talking about was, so it's really not just risk for risk's sake. It's got to be a well-planned, well-calculated attempt to control those elements of risk. Is that correct? Absolutely, yeah.
So if you're talking about skydiving as a form of edge work, you don't get people skydiving without a parachute.
Yep.
You obviously take the equipment that you need in order to overcome the challenge that this involves. It's not just being an adrenaline junkie or being, wanting to live on the edge. It's about wanting to give yourself the opportunity to demonstrate to yourself as much to others your true character, your true self.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense in the, with all the training that we do and that has to be done, really. It elevates it beyond what someone might just do if they took a fight on a day's notice with no training. We can't, as you might say, we can't really look at them as another edge worker, which I guess brings up something else you touched on in your paper, which was the idea of what you called independent fighters, but what I guess might more colloquially be known as cans, or just fighters who maybe aren't putting in the effort of others, let's just say. Can you expand a bit more upon that idea then, and how that you mentioned would rob some fighters of the satisfaction of doing that edge work?
Yeah, that's the cans and the crush matches it's sometimes referred to, I suppose. In the UK at the moment, I'm not sure if it's the same in Australia. I would imagine probably is, if the organisation of MMA is anything like it is here. It's quite common for these very low-skilled type of journeyman fighter that travels around to earn a quick buck for filling in for people who've pulled out at the last minute. They don't put any resistance in, or some of them might, but there's no real chance that this guy is going to win the fight. So they're purely there to keep a fight on the card. And promoters generally, the lower level promoters, seem quite happy to employ them. Not all of the promoters, I must say. The study that I've recently finished, which was about a different topic, it was about medical provision in these sports. So I was sort of seeing this phenomenon through the eyes of the medics who were there, and they really didn't like it. The amount of risks these guys were taking with their health, fighting, sometimes 3 times on a weekend, and getting the crap kicked out of them each time. But yeah, the promoters that I encountered, some of them wouldn't employ these guys, but a lot of them did, purely to protect ticket sales. You've got a fighter who sold a lot of tickets, And if he gets pulled from the card at the last minute, his fans are going to want refunds. It's going to damage your reputation and all the rest of it. So they do employ them quite often. And yeah, these guys, they take fights far more regularly than they should. And of course, they aren't taking the beatings in training because they aren't training, and they're not taking that much of a beating on the night because they just sort of fold within 30 seconds. But the fact that they are getting, they're getting properly tuned up, some of them, each time they get in the cage, it does pose a bit of a risk to, thinking about brain damage, concussions and so on, accumulation of repeated strong blows in a very short space of time. So it does happen. With respect to its implications for edge work, generally speaking, and again, this is a generalization, it might not be true of everybody in the field, most people in MMA don't look too kindly on this kind of thing. They don't really appreciate what these guys represent. They know that it's there as a quick fix to keep a card sort of, looking reasonably healthy. And of course, if you have done a training camp, it might be better than nothing that you step in the cage and do something, even if it's over in 20 seconds. But yeah, generally they're not looked on with much favour because their presence, it detracts from the opportunity to really test yourself. If I've trained for 6 months and I've seen these developments in my abilities, and then I've put in a really grueling few weeks of a training camp, I'm having my first fight and the experience is over that quickly, and I know and everybody else knows it wasn't a real fight, then it certainly isn't the same as if I'd had a fair match with somebody who is at my level. So yeah, there is a sense that perhaps their presence kind of detracts from the opportunity to experience edge work. And in the paper, I argued that this was one of those sort of exceptions that proves the rule about what motivates fighters and what the relationship should be between two evenly matched opponents in the ring.
Yeah, okay. So I guess then, along with the idea of it being a mutually constructed risk that these two people are undertaking, you could also look at it like there's a mutually constructed reward that both parties have to bring to reap the full benefits of the experience of a fight. Would that be one way of looking at it?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah. Even if I lose, if I've still, if we've gone out for 3 rounds or however long the fight is, if we're amateurs or whatever, and, we've put ourselves through our paces, and, we've really sort of proven that we've got what it takes. And, for some people, even getting into the cage is a victory in itself, to come that far in your training and to not back out from nerves and so on. Even if I lose, I've still experienced that thing that's really valuable to me. So certainly, yeah, I wouldn't have been able to get that reward without my opponent. Even if they beat me, I still got that thing that I wanted. Of course, I might be upset. I might be in tears, but I'll reflect on it as, that was my first fight and I learned so much. And I learned about what I'm really, really capable of, et cetera, et cetera. So sure, yeah, I think there's certainly a mutually constructed reward. If you're a professional, the reward is it might be financial, particularly if you're developing a career, as well as the experience of the fight. But certainly at amateur level, I think the rewards are far more intrinsic, and without your opponent, you're not going to be able to get them. Yeah,
I think there's definitely that, that change of motivation, or just those different opportunities for motivation when it turns into the professional realm. But it does seem like there's all the intrinsic motivation, especially, of course, at the amateur level, that would even draw those professionals into the sport to begin with. I mean, other conversations I've had with fighters will, touch on if people are doing this just for the money, just for the to make it professionally, they're going to have a hard time, because you've got to get through a lot of low-paying fights first before that slight chance of making big money even gets put on the table. So, of
course, yeah.
Yeah, so... And I mean, one thing you talk about in your paper too is then how people will, or the idea of those lower skilled fighters will then have the onlookers or other people kind of detracting from the experience as well, right? And that was one thing I thought of, was that for me, if I see someone beat a can and then they celebrate a bit too much, like they're a bit too happy with themselves, I don't know, this could be a reflection on me, that I'm like, come on, settle down. I saw that other bloke's record, and, maybe you should just, be a bit more subdued in your celebration. Is that anything you'd picked up on with other people, or is that just my own, my own problem?
That's really funny. You should bring that up. Actually, I have, My day job, I'm a lecturer, right? The majority of my work, I'm teaching, and I teach on a PE program and sport management and sports studies. And I have a module that's in martial arts, and we do a little bit of practical. We go on field trips to boxing gym and the MMA gym, have a karate guy come in and do some stuff. So we got some practical things going on. And we also have quite a lot of theory where we talk through some of the stuff that, some of the stuff that I've done. And there's plenty of other martial arts studies literature that we work through. And we had a lecture on this sort of topic a couple of years ago. And, we actually addressed this point. Is it, what is worth celebrating as a fighter if we take all of this into account? We watched a video of a guy that I don't know him that well. I've met him, and when I first met him, he was, I'm a pro fighter, and I've had, here's my record. Oh, that's really impressive. And I thought, this guy's the real deal. And then I saw his videos of who he's fought, and they're all cans, and it's just quite funny using it as a teaching resource to get the students to reflect on these questions of motivation and, intrinsic versus extrinsic and the sort of wider structure of the sport. It's a good question. And I don't think you're alone at all in raising an eyebrow at the over-enthusiastic celebrations of both fighters.
Yeah, because I know it's one of those things that it's kind of only to the trained eye that can pick that up. It's, for the majority of people in the crowds, they might not see the other person's record, or they just might not notice the skill disparity. And for them, it's just win's a win. And it's really, you can look at someone else who knows and goes, give a nod of, that was a bit easy for them, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And there's kind of that undercurrent of understanding there.
Yeah.
And then I guess, so the overall, idea then of the paper that you've put forward is that, these negotiations are going on then constantly with people inside the sport, and that it kind of has to be outlined then to receive the full benefits other than a monetary gain, right? Both competitors have to come into the sport looking for that reward in a good fight with each other. And then that offers up those moments of self-reflection and, time of introspection back on training and how you performed and how you handled that risk. And, I guess that reflection and that experience then is where the value can come from. Is that round in the right ballpark?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that both fighters necessarily need to have that as their sort of primary or only motivation.
Okay.
But certainly, yeah, if somebody throws a fight, for instance, then it's ruined it for the other person. And if you both do share that motivation, then I suppose it would be, that notion of community and friendship that forms after a fight. If I lose and I was only really in it for the paycheck, or I was only really in it because I want to improve my record and fight someone better, and I've lost, then there'd be some sour grapes, and I wouldn't really look at it in the same way that my opponent might, who was, really genuinely seeking that kind of that introspection and that chance to demonstrate autonomy and so on and so on. So I wouldn't have thought that it needs both people to really be aligned with that motivation, although I think in most cases, most fighters probably are, even if they have other things going on as well that drive them. But yeah, certainly when you've got those very one-sided matches with the independent fighters, the cans, or when you have a match that perhaps somebody isn't really taking very seriously, there are numerous ways it can go wrong. An early stoppage as well. Nobody likes an early stoppage, least of all the fighter who got eye poked and feels fine, because they've been robbed by circumstance. I didn't include that many notes from the fieldwork in that paper because of lack of space. There were several examples, and I'm sure you and your listeners will be familiar with these sort of situations at fight nights where there's been an eye poke or there's a heavy bleed, and if it's an amateur fight, usually the medics and the ref will maybe be a little bit more hesitant to let them continue, even if they say they're fine. And you do get that really strong anticlimax, don't you? And you can feel for these guys because they've been no fault of their own. They've been deprived of what they've been working for.
Yeah, certainly a few things come to mind when you mention that. And actually, I was just reminded then of something that I did myself, where I guess there was a fight that I was, taking a lot of punches, and the ref didn't stop it. I ended up coming back and winning it. And I remember thanking the ref for, thanks for letting that go on and allowing me to, get that victory. And as you're saying that, I'm kind of thinking, yeah, that's, I guess to any outsider, that would seem like a weird kind of gesture to say, thanks for allowing me to take some additional shots to the head and give an opportunity to come back and win. Yeah,
absolutely. I think referees face such a dilemma in those situations, because the majority of them have been fighters themselves, haven't they? And they know what it's like. They empathize, and they know that if they stop it early, it deprives you of that experience. It possibly deprives you of a chance for victory, and that becomes important for your livelihood if you're a pro. They also know that it deprives the fans who are paying and financially supporting the sport of a good, sort of more climactic end. So they have to balance all of that with the stated commitment, which all the referees I spoke to, all of them said front and center, the most important thing is the fighter's welfare. And, I'm the only one, that rests on my shoulders, because, it's very rare, isn't it, for a corner to throw in the towel, and it's very rare for a fighter to, tap to strikes or something. So it's the referee has the primary responsibility. And yeah, the kind of pressures they're under to balance all of those sort of competing risks, if you like, and make decisions in split seconds. I don't envy them, for sure.
No, I would not be that keen to start getting into refereeing, but never say never. It seems like that could be another element of risk, accepting risk going on if you decide to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. It's one of the things that I haven't got round to it yet with the study that I'm currently writing up the research on medics. A couple of papers out on that now, but I want to write something about the referees that I encounter, because I think it's such a fascinating job, and the decisions that they have to make and the situations they make them in, and all the risks they have to balance while processing that. It's remarkable. So maybe next year I'll have something out about referees. Fingers crossed.
Beautiful. Well, I'll make sure to read that as well. And then I guess so, finishing on from that, or moving on from the idea, moving on from the ideas that you've put forward there, what can, people be doing themselves to kind of help reframe that idea of violence in the sport we love? I know you've got a organization called Love Fighting Hate Violence that aims to potentially do that.
Yeah, so Love Fighting Hate Violence is something that, as I say, Christopher Matthews, my colleague, and I, we set this up a few years ago now. And initially we wanted it to be sort of an online sort of presence for fostering this kind of debate. We've also written a coaching toolkit, which we've designed so that coaches can explicitly use martial arts sort of games and activities that involve martial arts training to specifically teach young people about consent and about respecting your own as well as others' limits, and being explicit about what you're okay with, and basically trying to use that knowledge that a lot of fighters, a lot of martial artists have about the difference between fighting that isn't violent and fighting that is violent. That knowledge that's often quite tacit, it's often implicit. It's not something we spend a lot of time maybe discussing it, overtly, and trying to use that knowledge as a way to make that explicit and to teach consent to young people. Which we hear a lot about the positive role of martial arts in reducing bullying, for instance. In generally sort of encouraging people to be more disciplined and to be more respectful and all the rest of it. And we thought that with Fighting Hate Violence, or LFHV, we can try and do something that is purposefully aimed towards that, rather than just sort of assuming it happens on its own. If you put on a boxing club and you get some kids along, they will become respectful. Not necessarily, right?
Yeah.
Especially not if they only go once a week, right? But if you do something purposeful, you specifically work towards those learning outcomes that you want, then maybe we'll have some more tangible and robust results with that. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. So we've written this coaching toolkit, and we've distributed it to a few of our sort of partners in the project, and we're hoping to eventually do a study on how well this has worked, and refine it, and make a sort of version 2 and push that out more widely.
Okay, I really like that idea, because, as you say, it's accepted that it's just an intrinsic part of learning martial arts, but everyone can probably think of an example where it hasn't quite panned out that way with someone. And I do wonder if it's something with MMA where kind of some of that philosophy maybe was thrown out along with, you know, a lot of other traditional martial arts techniques where, you know, the kind of all the discipline and respect, even though I do believe that's still, you know, taught in MMA, it's maybe not as much at the forefront as what it is or was in other traditional martial arts. Is that something that you would consider a possibility as well?
Yeah, I don't think you're a million miles away, really. My own take on this is that it's highly specific to the gym that you're talking about, the instructor, the local school. You know, we've got sort of fairly well-established notions that traditional, particularly Asian martial arts are grounded in a culture of respect and discipline and so on. But equally, you know, you could have schools where you get taught karate and you don't get taught those things, or you know, to borrow from, you know, the Karate Kid, we've got a very clear example, you know, Cobra Kai, which is, I don't know if you've watched the YouTube series, but there's sort of reinventing. I love that, by the way.
It's
good. Talk about that for hours as well. But yeah, they're kind of reinventing it and sort of rescuing the legacy of Cobra Kai and that approach to martial arts as being valuable, right? It's not just about, you know, showing respect at all times. Actually, you sometimes need to go out and stand up for yourself by beating up your bullies. So, you know, there's various ways that we can articulate what it means to be a fighter and why we should train to fight. And I wouldn't want to say that, you know, categorically traditional martial arts do this well and MMA does it less so. Although you might be right that there's, you know, as a sort of general observation, there's less of a tradition in MMA really, and less importance attached to that in MMA. Again, historically speaking, but from one school to the next, it could vary, you know, a great deal.
Yeah, that makes sense that it is going to come down to, you know, the culture within the gym that is going to be the, you know, the main determinant of that. Because, yeah, while I feel that, you know, in our gym that it certainly is an element, it is kind of, you know, with the focus just being on effective techniques and just, you know, whatever works, use it. It does seem to be something that, well, you're not going to spend valuable training time worrying about the philosophy of something when you better just be doing the things that work and they're going to win you the fight potentially anyway. So I do like that idea. And I guess what would be some of the, you know, if you don't mind, maybe one of the examples of in the coaching toolkit that people could, you know, put into practice?
Yes, sure. That's no problem. I can probably send you a couple of copies if you'd like, which we'll sort out later, I guess.
Yes, please.
So through. The important thing is, you know, as you said, why would you waste valuable time on, you know, on something that's all about philosophy and not about training? And it is, you know, what we've got here. It's not something that's going to make you a better fighter per se. You know, this is specifically geared towards, I'd say younger adults and children. Really, it's supposed to be a fun way of teaching them things like, you know, respect and consent and what have you. So we draw on the idea of values-based teaching, which my colleagues at the University of Brighton have been using for many years in our Football for Peace program, which is a similar sort of idea. You use football-related games to teach a set of values. So one of the activities, which one should I talk about? So there's a game where we do we sort of divide the space into 4 quadrants. And in the first quadrant, you know, you might remember this sort of thing from PE from back in the day. We do this all the time when I'm teaching PE students. We've got these 4 quadrants divided by a rope or by cones or whatever we want to use, markings on the gym floor. And in one quadrant, we're only doing punches. In another quadrant, we're only doing kicks. In the third one, we can do punches and kicks. And in the fourth one, let's say we'll just throw elbows, for instance. And one person's on the pads, one person's doing the movement. And you move around in your pairs around these 4 quadrants. And as you cross that line, you then need to pay attention to that and you just switch to only doing kicks. Or you could do it where you're not using pads, but one person's the attacker, one person's the defender and so on. And you use that little game, you get them doing it for a minute or 2. And then you use that game as a way to think about that notion of crossing the line. What does it mean to cross the line? We say that all the time, don't we? But what does it mean, to cross the line? And then you get, thinking about younger children, you'll get some answers, and it gives you a chance to have a quick little discussion about what crossing the line means. And then we could talk about things like, is there an appropriate space for you to punch people? So in the game, it was that first quadrant. Yeah. In the gym, it's okay to punch in the gym. If you go into the boxing ring, it's okay to punch there. What about if we go outside? No, it's not okay. So it's a way of just basically using these little games as a kind of physical metaphor, if you like, to help teach those lessons. And again, this isn't about martial arts training. It's about things that martial arts coaches or PE teachers who do martial arts, things that you can use to sort of make a fun and imaginative way to teach children about these values.
Yeah, I really like that idea. I think that's great, especially for youth and teens classes. That sounds like a wonderful way to help impart, I guess, as you were saying, a physical metaphor, impart some knowledge of these topics in a fun and engaging way. I think that's great. I'd love to see that the rest of those games that you've got.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to share. We do want to make a digitized version, but we've been holding off on it because, as I say, we want to refine it a little bit after we've done some evaluation of it, and we'd rather not send it far and wide until we're really confident in what we've produced. But yeah, I'm happy to send you a copy of that. Have a look through. Yeah,
sounds great. And then, so if people want to get involved with Love Fighting Hate Violence, what should they do to try and help you out in supporting that?
Well, it's been a while since we've been doing anything on the Facebook and on the blog and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But we do always want to, we Christopher and I keep saying, we got to kickstart this again. If we've got folks listening who are who've got something to say about this sort of stuff, anything to share, sort of whether that be a reflection on something that's happened recently in the world of combat sports, whether it's something to do with lessons that they've used that are like the one I just described that they know can be useful, anything that might sort of fit on our blog. As I say, we haven't updated it in a fair while, but if you do go on lfhv.org, you'll see on the blog there's a few entries there, about sort of 1,000 to 2,500 word long kind of mini essays. If anyone wants to write for us, that's great. We always love to receive that. Give us a like on Facebook and a follow on Twitter. That might give us a little bit of a reminder that we need to update those things and get moving with it. But otherwise, just sort of watch this space, really. We're hoping that in the new year, once the lockdown hopefully is over, we'll be moving forwards again with the evaluation of the coaching toolkit and hopefully have something more tangible a little bit later on.
Beautiful. I really like that idea, and I've really been enjoying this discussion, Alex. It's been great. And I'm wondering if people want to get in touch with you, what is the best way that they should go about doing that?
Drop me an email. That's the best way. a.channon@brighton.ac.uk. You'll find it if you Google my name and University of Brighton. You'll find all my contact details. But yeah, email is definitely the best way. Always checking my emails way too often than I should. Yeah, always happy to receive.
As we all do, probably. So yeah, that's been wonderful, and I'm very interested in those other upcoming studies that you mentioned you're undertaking, especially if we go back to the start when we were talking about how the negotiation process takes place during sparring. That's something that's always fascinated me. So I'll be very interested to see what you come up with in that.
Brilliant. Yeah, well, that's a good little bit of motivation for me to put that to the top of my agenda then. I've got a loose first draft to revisit, very loose first draft, which needs a lot of work. But we'll get there by the end of the summer, hopefully, on that one.
Beautiful. Because, it's always, that's just fascinated me how it's all worked out in sparring. It's, do it every week and it's still sometimes, it's just astounds me how it all plays out.
Yeah, people who've been training for years and years still get it wrong, and you still find themselves in moments where you sort of cringe at your own,
Yeah.
So it's a really fascinating thing.
Oh, beautiful, Alex. I'll let you go, and you have a wonderful day.
Well, thank you so much, Sonny. Thanks again for having me on. Yeah, cheers.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you.
You have been listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Until next time, you can visit sonnybrown.net to find out more ways to break it down.